Okay. Wow. Good morning, friends. We're going to continue our journey with the Yoga Sutras. So, if you weren't here last week, basically, I'm just working our way through the Yoga Sutras, which are a guide to how to do and be and live your yoga. We did the first one, the first sutra last week, so I'm going to move us into the second sutra. This sutra is probably the most oft quoted sutra of the entire text. Yoga teachers like to say this even in Sanskrit out loud. So if you've ever heard this, I won't be surprised. And a lot of you guys are teachers, so I know that you've studied these. Yoga Sutra 1.2 is in Sanskrit. Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha. I'm sure that was pronounced wrong, but that's the way I've heard my teacher say it. And in English, what our teacher Sri Swami Satchidananda says is, the restraint of the modifications of the mind stuff is yoga. The restraint of the modifications of the mind stuff is yoga. So the translation is, chitta is mind stuff. That's his translation. Vritti are modifications. And nirodha is a restraint. Before I talk a little bit about my experience of this Yoga Sutra, I'd love to hear from any of you about your study or consideration, or even if you read it this morning, what came up for you?
I really liked this sutra. It really sort of, the entire world is your own projection. That's just mind-boggling and true.
Do you want to say more about that?
And no, I think that sums it up.
Okay, yeah. All right. Good. Yes, you got it. Who else? I like that in this translation, Satchidananda uses examples that we can relate to. And he talks about how what we experience is our experience, and then we put things on top of it. It reminds me a little bit of what Viktor Frankl teaches in his book, which I'm losing the name of it right now, but he was a gentleman who spent years in a concentration camp. And his basic teaching after that experience was, we are creating our own experience of this, and how we create that is up to us. So just even the thought of being in a concentration camp and what the suffering must have been in that situation, to come out of that experience and able to be okay and find some peace in the world is a pretty awe-inspiring experience. And he was teaching the same thing as this sutra does. So a couple of other translations here. The vrittis, which he calls the modifications, I've heard as ripples, fluctuations, waves. It basically is talking about what our mind is intended to do by design, right? So our mind is meant to think, and the way our mind works is we have a cascade of thoughts very quickly from a stimulus. There's all kinds of things that come into our mind. And we don't necessarily want to say that all thinking is bad, but we want to be able to step back from what the thoughts are that are forming and identify if they're, I'll just use the word healthy. It seems appropriate for our age and time in the world, right? Are our thoughts healthy? And are they giving us not only a healthy mental experience, but also physical experience? We know that stress manifests in disease, so unhealthy thoughts can lead to physical disease as well. So the modifications, and then chitta is, he calls it mind stuff. And there's lots of different translations of this word. I like that mind stuff, right? It's hard to actually put your finger on it. What is it? It's mind stuff. So we've got waves of mind stuff happening. And the aim of yoga, according to the sutra, is to still the fluctuations of the mind stuff. Different translations use different word for the nirodha. He says restraint, still, calm. I've heard the word cessation. Like that's actually the translation I hear most often. Yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. And the more that I've studied this, the more I don't know that word lands for me. Cessation to me means like it's done, it's complete, and it's final. And the way Satchidananda describes it is it's a restraint. So it's a holding a pattern, but it doesn't mean it ends. And in my experience of my own practice, that's kind of how I learn and interpret so much of this is kind of what my experience is. I can restrain, but I mean, in my experience, like in my study, the only time that they'll be totally done is when I'm dead, not in this physical body. And even, the teachings about the Buddha and the Buddhist practices to help still our mind, those teachings don't say that enlightenment is a permanent state necessarily. Like the Buddha himself came back from an experience of enlightenment and taught about his experience. And so I think this is important as we start to learn to meditate, to understand that we're not trying to stop thinking. Like this isn't like, oh, like you're just going to stop thinking or you're going to exist in the world in a pure state of yoga all the time. What we're learning to do is train our mind so that we can distinguish how our mind is working in our experience of the world and find a place that is, well, the way we want it ultimately. And there's some training in the way we want it. At this point in my life, peace is what I'm seeking. I think there were times in my life where drama is what I was seeking. And I could recognize and find that where I wanted to. And that's true in everything that we experience. So if we want to be able to tell a dramatic story about our experience, we can interpret the things that actually happen to create that. So our practice is around restraining the modifications, calming the modifications, so that we can start to see things kind of in their, I'll call it the naked reality, the truth of what is. So before I lead us into a meditation around this, any other thoughts, comments, questions? Okay, we're moving slowly through this book. And so I think today the meditation I'm going to lead is really just around being able to see the modifications as opposed to totally restraining them. Okay, so I'm going to invite us into a practice where we're going to use a tool to start to still the mind, to narrow it from all the things to the breath. And then hopefully your mind will wander away from the breath. So you can do this practice of seeing where the mind goes. And I will periodically verbally cue you back into your breath. And the next modification that comes up may or may not be the same thing. But there's just a practice of observing what comes up and then releasing it and coming back to the restraint, the tool that we use for restraint. Does that make sense? Okay. I mean, it's what we do all the time. but we'll be a little bit more explicit about like why we're doing this. Okay, so take your seat. Posture, some of you guys are already there. Create yourself. I'm going to mute you guys at this point. And I invite you to close your eyes. It helps minimize the modifications, the distractions. If that doesn't work, you can just lower your eyes. Create a drishti, steady gaze. One of the most common modifications of the mind in meditation is the physical distraction of the body. So I always invite us to begin by creating the body in a way that is less distracting. So create your seat so that you feel supported. Create your hands so that they're doing something on purpose. For many of us, our back will begin to experience sensation if we aren't upright and easeful. So create that right where you are. And come into your breath. Your mind noticing your breath. This morning, notice it in the place where it's most obvious. So it might be the gentle rise and fall of your abdomen, or the sensation of your breath in your nose. And if observing is creating modifications, thoughts about the experience of the feeling, then maybe a mantra is more useful. Breathing in, I know that I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I know that I'm breathing out. It might take a moment to settle. You will take a moment to just come into the practice of observing the breath. Even right now, your mind might be observing yourself, observing. When you do get these interruptions, just notice what it is. Is it analysis? Is it emotional? What comes up? I'm going to invite us into a practice called labeling, where as you sit and your mind wanders off, notice the type of thought that it is and give it a name. So it might be feeling, ruminating, worry, figuring out, solving. Once you've labeled your fluctuation, return to your breath. Back to the breath. Notice if your body is holding any sort of tension or reaction to your thoughts, gripping, tightness. Maybe they're deeply layered thoughts, more unconscious than conscious. Anchor back to your breath if you're not there. Take a couple of deep breaths. You can open your eyes when you're ready. I have a few other thoughts, and then I'd love to hear from you. So Satchitananda, his name, Swami Satchitananda, that's actually a given name by his teacher probably. And Sat means truth. Chit, we just talked about as being modifications of the mind, or I'm sorry, mind stuff. And Ananda is bliss. And when I learned that, they usually translate his name as truth, consciousness, and bliss. Truth, consciousness, and bliss, which means Chit is actually consciousness in that translation. And so just that distinguishing between mind stuff and consciousness took me to a new place in my practice around like, oh, how often am I unconscious versus conscious or subconscious versus just like right here consciousness of what's in the room. And it's like, for me, it's a kind of a new layer of like not just the thinking mind, but the unconscious mind versus the conscious mind. And what I'm getting present to is the unconscious mind is part of what's manifesting physically in my body. Right? So I might be blissed out in thought, but tense in my body. And then there's an awareness that comes in the meditation that's like, well, why are you gripping? Like, you're telling everybody everything's okay when they ask how you're doing. Something's in there. And so there's there's layers of awareness of our chitta also, which makes this kind of a lovely infinite practice. And I think that's a good thing, right? It's not like I'm going to figure this out and be like, okay, now what? I'm fascinated by these practices. Any thoughts on your end, Marcia?
I'll share something that you had said, that you shared with us many times about your granddad and you, and oh, there you go again. When my mind starts with stuff, it's oh, there you go again. And I'm saying that to myself, and it just, takes me back to what you shared. And I love those words. So what you just said, I find fascinating myself because, as you know, and maybe the others, I have an essential tremor that sometimes when I get a little more agitated, it gets a little more pronounced. What happened to me this morning was so much unconscious stuff because I was just, that tremor was all over my body. And when you said these words now, it was like, that is amazing because it happened. It's just, and I'm still feeling it, so I'm just calm down and breathe. But it was vivid. So, yeah, I have work to do, Kate.
Well, it's a two-way street. Like, this is the thing about the practice is these practices will reveal to us where there's some work, but then we use the same practices to make it through the day.
Yeah.
Like, we got to be able to get through the day. And so using our breath to, like, at least at the conscious level, create some peace of mind is really an amazing practice. And then we can start to work on the other stuff, but still not,
Yeah, and that's
be
what
unable to live in the world.
Yeah. Anyway, it happened this morning. So
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Well, I have the other quote from this little section or two. And by the way, very good way to get job security. If you're going to do one a week, you can do this meditation thing like for the next 5 years. So,
right.
Good plan. But the other quote is, if you control your mind, you have controlled everything. And I really like that because I am prone to spinning out and awfulizing and going down rabbit holes. So this is kind of key for me.
Yeah, and the practice teaches us to be like, oh, there I go again. Like, okay, well, who's in charge? I love it. Yeah, yes, 196 sutras. So that's some good job security. We might not do all of them, but we're going to go down this path for a while. All right. Well, I appreciate you guys, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Namaste.